Hi everyone. Let's try to learn something from Game 2 of the World Championship. Carlsen has the white pieces in this game, Nepomniachtchi has the black, and Carlsen opens with d4. Knight f6, c4, and the first surprise to me was the move e6 here. Nepo is known to play the Gruenfeld as his main weapon against d4, and the Gruenfeld would be reached through g6. And then knight c3, d5, and that's the Gruenfeld. Perhaps he's so well known for playing the Gruenfeld that he surmised that Carlsen would be extremely well prepared to meet it. And so they avoided his pet line, and Nepo plays e6. Knight f3 by Carlsen, avoiding the Nimzo Indian defense, which can occur after knight c3, then bishop b4 is the Nimzo, an excellent defense for black. So knight f3 is often referred to as an anti-Nimzo line. And now d5. So the players transpose into a queen's gambit declined. And in this position, white needs to decide what to do with the light-squared bishop. It can become active on this diagonal or on this diagonal. And Carlsen decides to play g3, which is known as the Catalan opening. A standard queen's gambit decline could have been reached by knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, castles, and e3. So the light-squared bishop would protect the pawn on c4, and it probably would get to the d3 square. But in the Catalan, as in the game, the bishop is going to be placed on the long diagonal, exerting pressure on black's queenside. Okay, here black plays bishop e7, a closed Catalan variation, then bishop g2, castles, castles, and black takes on c4. So in the Catalan, white has to be prepared to sacrifice this c4 pawn. There are ways of recovering it, but white often tries to get compensation for that pawn. Okay, Carlsen goes for queen to c2 here, attacking that pawn directly, also strengthening an e4 pawn push, getting a nice classical center. There are other ways to play this position. Another popular move here is knight e5. That's a typical move in the Catalan. The knight is strongly placed in the center. The diagonal is now open for the bishop. And the knight is putting pressure on the c6 square, as well as threatening to win the pawn back on c4. So typical play from here is knight c6, and now both minor pieces can capture on c6. For example, bishop takes c6, giving up the Catalan bishop, followed by something like this, and that's a position reached many times, or going back. Perhaps knight takes c6, keeping the Catalan bishop, and white can play against those tripled isolated pawns and win one or two of them and have an excellent game. But in this game, Carlsen goes for queen to c2, and now Nepomniachtchi plays a rare move b5 in the position to directly defend the c4 pawn. Much more common is a6. And after a6, a couple common moves here. You can take the pawn immediately and then face b5, losing a tempo. The queen has to drop back to c2, and then black fianchettos his bishop to challenge the Catalan bishop. So that's one theoretical line. Another way to play after seeing a6 is to play a4 to try to stop black from playing b5. And then the game could proceed like this: bishop d7, queen takes on c4, and now the bishop gets active on the c6 square. So those lines have both been played many, many times. But b5 is rare and sharp. The long diagonal is open now. But Carlsen makes an even rarer move. I looked at the Lichess Masters database in this position, and there were 469 games, and only one of them featured the move that Carlsen played in this position, which is knight to e5. Don't worry about the inaccuracy mark here. Lichess doesn't always do a great job marking inaccuracies by doing just a quick computer analysis, but the computer did prefer the natural move A4. Often when black puts a pawn on B5 in a queen's pawn opening, white does strike it with A4, trying to undermine support of C4. But knight to e5 apparently is a perfectly playable move. The engine assesses this as approximately equal. The bishop is threatening the rook in the corner, and the knight is actively placed in the center of the board. And this surprised Nepomniachtchi, I believe, and he decided to go for c6 to defend his rook. Another way to defend the diagonal is to place a knight on d5. But he goes for c6, and now white could take a pawn, win a pawn back on c6, but instead he goes for a4. It actually would be a strategic mistake to take on c6, because then this would happen, and black's queenside suddenly comes to life. It's very easy for him to develop, and white doesn't have anything in this opening. Material is equal, and it's actually black who is developed slightly better. So Carlsen wants to leave that pawn on c6, and that hampers black's queenside development. So it's going to be quite a while before these pieces get untangled. And white plays a4. Okay, now knight d5, centralizing the knight. Knight c3, attacking it. Another possible way of playing here suggested by the engine was to take on b5 first and then play knight to c3. And I think the point of this is drawing the pawn off of this c6 square like that opens the long diagonal. And now the knight is pinned, and white is threatening to win the pawn on b5 as well. For example, a line goes f6, and the knight wants to retreat to g4, keeping the diagonal clear here. He doesn't want to go to f3. And then queen to d7 to support the b5 pawn, knight to e3 after that, putting more pressure on the d5 knight, which is pinned, but then bishop b7 defends it, and black is doing fine. So going back to the game, knight c3 was played without exchanging pawns on b5, and now black decides to play f6 and kicks the knight back. Carlsen withdraws it to f3. Queen to d7 is played because white was threatening to take twice on the b5 square, so the queen is lending support so black doesn't lose a pawn. And now Carlsen expands in the center with e4, gaining a tempo on the knight, trying to get some good central play here. But as compensation, black is going to get a very powerful knight after knight b4 was played. That knight is headed for the great outpost on d3. Okay, the queen is under attack. Carlsen puts it on e2, and the knight goes to d3. Again, I don't think that is an inaccuracy, even though Lichess has marked it as such. Okay, and now e5 is played, and the game gets rather complicated here, and of course I don't fully understand it. These are world champions and world champion contenders. But I suppose that move is vacating the e4 square for a knight, and that knight would love to get to maybe d6 at some point. And Nepo plays bishop b7, starts to finally develop his queenside. I wondered whether f5 was a good move here just to protect that square. Apparently it's playable. The engine says it's about equal. Another interesting line is for black to take on e5. But it turns out to favor white. White can take back with the knight, and that knight is forking the queen and the knight, and white would love to take that knight on d3 off the board and even win a pawn on the d3 square. And if black tries to take the d4 pawn with his queen and protect the knight, then white can take on c6, and after the knights are exchanged, the rook is attacked, it slides over. A takes b5, solidifies that bishop, and this is a very nice construction here. So white is actually in the driver's seat in that position. So going back to the game, Nepo played bishop b7, and then Carlsen takes the pawn on f6. Nepo recovers the pawn with his bishop. The knight goes into e4 and attacks the dark squared bishop. And that knight maybe wants to go to c5, I'm not sure. But knight a6 is played, continuing to develop the queen side. That knight can come into either b4 or c5 if that pawn should leave. And now knight e5. The engine doesn't like that move very much, although the position is still about equal. The engine suggests that b3 is a better move in the position. We won't analyze it too deeply because, again, this middle game is too complicated for my puny brain. So Carlsen plays knight e5, attacks the queen and attacks that knight on d3 as mentioned in the other line. And Nepo takes that knight off the board. D takes e5 in return. And now here is a move that in the press conference Carlsen said he overlooked. Knight a to c5. And apparently it's a pretty powerful move. I think it's because that knight is headed for the b3 square, and that powerful pair of knights can do some damage and probably win an exchange, as we will see in the game. And Carlsen thought hard here for a while and decided to give up the exchange in order to put a knight on this powerful d6 outpost. Now here's why he's going to lose the exchange. Nepo puts the knight on b3, and so the rook on a1 is under attack, but the bishop on c1 is under attack by two different knights here. So this rook cannot leave the back rank, for example, without losing that bishop. So it has to move over to b1 if it wants to save itself, which is exactly what Carlsen did. But then Nepo takes the bishop and wins the exchange. Now, I think Carlsen was criticized for this move, rook to b1, by some commentators, and suggested, and the engine suggests this as well, bishop e3 might have been a better way to give up the exchange, saving the dark squared bishop, just giving up the rook on a1 in this manner. I'm not really sure which way is better. I'm sure Carlsen is doing just fine the way he did it. The engine does give black a small advantage in the position. Okay, rook a b8 was played, defending the bishop, getting off of the long diagonal. Rook d1, putting the rook in line with the black queen. Bishop a8, so black decides to preserve his bishop to fight against the Catalan bishop, and has also calculated that white does not have any scary discovered attacks on the black queen. So he leaves the queen there for the time being. And now bishop e4 was played. c3, I'm not sure about this move. I don't really understand it. Maybe black is trying to clear the b file for his rook. Queen to c2 was played, making a battery attacking the h7 pawn. So g6 protects. B takes c3 next, and then black does open up the b file for his rook by exchanging pawns on a4. Rook f d8 actually pins the knight, so there can be no discovery on the queen because the rook would fall on d1. So Carlsen gets that rook out of the way so there's no more pin and attacks the a7 pawn in the process. Okay, c5 was played, opening the diagonal. The bishops are now facing each other. Queen c4. The bishops get exchanged. King h8. Maybe tucking the king into a safer square. The knight returns back to its beautiful outpost. Rook b6, maybe trying to double rooks on the b file. Giving up the c pawn, rook d b8. Now Carlsen marches his king to a safer square. a6 is played. King h3, getting off the diagonal. There will never be any checks on this diagonal, and the king is quite safe on the h3 square. Rook c6 attacks the queen. It goes to d4. King comes back to g8. c4. The ending here is completely equal as assessed by Stockfish on Lichess. Queen to c7. Queen to g4 attacking the e6 pawn. And it's at this point that Nepo probably realized he cannot play for win, even being an exchange up. Carlsen does have a pawn for the exchange, and his knight is just extremely powerful on the d6 square. So Nepo finds an easy way to secure a draw in the position. He gives the exchange back and wins the pawn back in the process. Okay, and the reason this is going to end up as a draw is because Nepo correctly surmised that all of these pawns will be traded off the board, and if black can get the queens off the board as well, then there will be a pretty simple drawn 3 versus 2 on the same side of the board in a rook and pawn endgame. So let's see what happened. Carlsen tries to decoy the queen with c5, trying to take the pawn on e6 if c5 gets taken. And that's exactly what happens, and apparently that is safe for black to do. White has no way to get to that black king. And these pawns all do get traded off, and now an excellent move, rook to f8, creates some threats here. We have a threat of queen takes f2, rook takes f2, maybe queen to h5 check, followed by queen to f3 check, and then taking on f2. But also, more importantly, queen to f5 is a threat because that will remove the queens from the board, giving us a very clear drawn pawn and rook endgame. Carlsen tries f4, addressing most of those threats, but not the threat of queen to f5 check. So the queens come off the board, and then the players play this pretty trivial endgame for grandmasters. We won't look at it too closely here, but Carlsen's only hope for some kind of play in the position is to push his h-pawn and trade it for black's g-pawn, getting a passed f-pawn in the process. This never happens. Nepo correctly brings his king up to the h6 square, and then king h4. The rook falls back to give some checks from behind, and that's exactly what happens. Carlsen does not take that pawn back. He pushes past it at this point. Rook g1 check, king f2, rook a1. The rook comes over to try to take the h-pawn, but Nepo is just going to attack the f4 pawn here and continually check. And the players agreed to a draw in this position. So I learned something by going over that game carefully, but I also learned that it was way over my head. Okay, thanks for watching.